Hello, my name is Jarrett Brown. I'm your classmate in Political Science 620 at Fort Hays State University. And today I'm going to be talking about my paper topic, which was the impact of the Michigan versus EPA decision in the United States Supreme Court, which took place in 2015. So basically what happened was Michigan sued the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, because it believed the agency wrongly omitted the question of cost when it created and enacted a regulation aimed at decreasing emissions from power plants. 23 states and several other private entities, private companies also sued the EPA for the same reason, because they believed that the regulation would be burdensome to them, and that it wasn't necessarily, basically. The case was originally heard by the D.C. Circuit Court, which was the court that Congress decided that cases regarding this type of litigation should be heard in. And the cases, the cases from the 23 states and also the private companies were all combined and heard at the same time by the Supreme Court in 2015. So basically, Congress empowered the EPA to regulate emissions from mobile and immobile sources in order to protect citizens from pollution through the Clean Air Act. And mobile sources are things like trains, cars, buses, anything that moves. And immobile sources are obviously anything that doesn't move, such as buildings, power plants, manufacturing facilities, anything that puts off any kind of pollution or emission. The CAA, the Clean Air Act, was amended in 1990 to include new standards which were aimed directly at mercury emissions from immobile sources, such as power plants. And the EPA enacted the Mercury Toxics Standards Rule, which I'll call MATS, in order to fulfill the mission created by the amendment. And the controversy that brought the case to court was that the petitioners, the people that filed the lawsuit, believed that the EPA erred, but they made a mistake by neglecting to consider costs when it enacted the rule. And they believe that the cost of the regulation on them and the cost of complying was much greater than the benefit. And the numbers that they used was something like $60 billion worth of cost and only 4 to 6 million with an M dollars worth of benefit. So as you can see, that there's a big difference between 60 billion and 4 and 6 million. It isn't quite that simple because there are other factors that also have to be factored in. But if you just look at those two numbers, you'll see later on as I go on kind of why the court made the decision that it did. So the EPA argued that cost was considered, but it was not considered at the beginning. So they're saying that they did consider cost, but they didn't consider it at the time that they decided that something needed to be done. Instead, they waited till they already knew something needed to be done and wanted something to be done, but they waited till the very end of that process. The EPA contended that it was authorized to enact any rule that was appropriate and necessary, and they believed that the potential hazards and potential health risk and public health problems that can be and are created by pollution make it appropriate and necessary for the rule to be enacted. So there were several relevant cases that considered cost, where the Supreme Court considered cost, and the court, when it made its decision, it went back and looked at these cases. They're called precedents. And so the three that I have listed are Textile Manufacturers, Textile Manufacturers Institute versus Donovan, which took place in 1981. Whitman versus American Trucking Associations, which took place in 2001. And the EPA versus EME Homer City Generation, which was a 2014 case. So as you can see, these cases have been heard over the last 35 years. And there are also two main relevant cases regarding the power of agencies to regulate, and the ones that are discussed most was Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council of 1984, and also Vehicle Manufacturers Association of United States versus State Farm Mutual Automobile Insurance Company, which took place in 1983. And you'll hear a lot about Chevron, the Chevron decision as I go through this, because the decision that they came to has had a really big impact on how the courts look at regulation and how they look at the power of agencies to regulate. But the decision in this case, in Michigan versus EPA, was 5-4 decision in favor of Michigan. And the court basically said that agencies must consider cost from the beginning. They can't wait till the end after they've already implemented a rule to, or basically implemented a rule to start thinking about how cost would affect those involved, and if cost matters to those involved. And the court also said that the agencies, like the EPA, deserve deference, but that their actions must be reasonable. So basically the court said that we're going to give you a certain amount of leeway, but we're not going to give you 100% freedom to do as you wish. You have to act within certain parameters. So they're only giving them so much space to make decisions. The justices that voted with the majority were Chief Justice Roberts, and also Scalia, Kennedy, Thomas, and Alito. And earlier from the course, we did a paper regarding the possibility that some justices might vote alongside others, or they may be grouped based on certain beliefs that they might have. And you can kind of see in this, Roberts, Scalia, Thomas, and Alito, they're generally considered to be conservative. And Kennedy is kind of usually in the middle, I think. He could go either way on a case. And then in the minority, you had Justices Kagan, Ginsburg, Breyer, and Sotomayor. And all four of those are generally considered more liberal or more to the left. And they voted that way in this case. Justice Scalia, who just died not too long ago, his majority opinion in the case basically said that he believed cost should have been considered from the beginning. And it's something that was obviously that important, that the factor of cost, the impact of cost, should have determined whether or not anything was ever done to regulate whatsoever. And basically, Justice Scalia relied on the court's opinions in State Farm and Chevron, which I just introduced a second ago, and he said that agencies must consider all relevant factors, and that they must operate within the bounds of reasonable interpretation. And so when the EPA didn't consider cost, in his opinion, from his conclusion, they didn't consider all relevant factors, and they acted in a way that wasn't deemed reasonable. On the losing side, in her minority opinion, Justice Ginsburg wrote that the rule was appropriate and necessary, obviously because of the potential environmental impact that pollution can have. She said that the EPA is required to consider costs, so she conceded that. She gave up that point. She said that is their responsibility because it's the rational thing to do, because costs can have a big effect on all sorts of different parties and on the economy and all sorts of different things. But she said that it wasn't necessary to do that from the beginning. So instead of being the main decider, for lack of a better word, so instead of being the main point of emphasis, cost should be just one consideration, a small consideration or a slight consideration that's a part of a much bigger picture. And she also noted that there were numerous indirect benefits of the rule that should have been factored in. So if you remember earlier, I put out two numbers, 60 billion and 4 to 6 million. There were, as a part of a study that was released by the EPA, they also said that there were billions and billions of dollars worth of indirect impact because the rule would actually also stop other pollutants other than mercury, which was the main pollutant that was being targeted. But there would be lots of other pollutants that would also have decreased emissions because of the rule, and so that's important to the environment and to this case and to the cost consideration of this case, because it kind of equals things out and kind of gives you the full picture of what the rule would do and what the actual costs are. And Justice Ginsburg also asserted that the EPA's process for creating and enacting the rule was not out of line with the court's previous rulings, or in other words, it was consistent with what the court believes the process should be. Justice Thomas, which I always find really interesting, a lot of his opinions, even though I don't necessarily agree with him, he had an entirely different take than the minority opinion and the majority opinion, even though he did join. He concurred with the majority's ruling. He kind of came to that conclusion for a different reason. He agreed that the court's decision in that it annulled the rule, that it said that the rule was not legal. However, he wrote that deferring to regulatory agencies or regulatory authorities violates the Constitution because doing so takes power away from the other three branches. And just to kind of explain this concept, basically agencies operate under a different set of laws, I guess you could say. They use administrative law. So basically Congress empowers agencies to create rules and to create regulations, enact those rules, enforce those rules, and be the judge of whether or not those rules are being complied with. So they're the legislative, or they're doing legislative, executive, and judicial work. Basically, they're doing all three things by themselves. And so Justice Thomas is basically saying that by giving them the authority to do that, they're taking away authority from Congress, from the President and the executive branch, and also from the judiciary, which would be the court, the federal courts, and of course the Supreme Court. So the impact of the decision is it's twofold in a lot of ways. Like, you can look at it in a very narrow way based on what the impact would be of the decision on the environment. In this case, the court said that the rule wouldn't be allowed to go forward. So there could be all sorts of potential environmental impacts by allowing pollution to happen, by not stopping pollution using this rule. And so basically it was designed to protect the air and protect the protect an environment, which would protect people, and which would protect water, and which would protect all sorts of other things. So the environmental impact, or the environmental problems that not enacting this rule could create are huge. They're, far and wide, all sorts of different issues could be created by not having this rule. And we haven't really, at this point, we haven't really seen the full extent of what's going to happen, because like the decision was just made in 2015, and the actual litigation regarding this case has been going on for a really long time as well. So we don't know what's going to be the full extent of it. But what we do know is that down the line, our kids or our grandkids, they're going to be the ones experiencing the pain, or the possibility of pain or suffering, of environmental degradation because of this decision. And let's see. Another impact of this case is that it chips away at Chevron deference. And remember, Chevron is one of those cases that I highlighted earlier. Chevron deference is the idea that that agencies should be given leeway, should be given the authority to make decisions that they think are ideal, or that they think are necessary and appropriate, based on what Congress, through laws, has told them to do. So Congress basically gives an agency a task, say protect the environment, or collect tax money, or anything along those lines. Anything that government does, it can sometimes delegate to different agencies. It tells them to do that, and then the courts have basically said, wait, let's step back and let them do their job and not tell them how to do it, with Chevron deference, which was kind of created as a result of the finding in Chevron that I discussed earlier. So since the courts have kind of taken away some of that power that agencies have had, some of that deference that has been given to them, they kind of have to take direction from somebody else, and it's not really clear where that's going to come from. If that's going to be Congress that's going to have to give them more clear directions, or if it's going to be courts that, case by case, courts or cases have to go to court, and the courts are going to decide what's appropriate, what's necessary, and what isn't. So it kind of creates a lot of instability for agencies, and it makes it a little bit more difficult for them to do what they need to do to carry out Congress's wishes. And so basically, as I was saying, it can kind of affect how other agencies, other than the EPA, any agency that you can think of, how they create, implement, and enforce rules. And also how they decide whether or not those rules are being complied with. And as I said, with the environmental impact, the full impact of this decision is not clear because it was made so recently. But in the years that come, I'm sure we're going to see more and more of an impact, and I'm fairly certain that the impact is going to be the two things I talked about regarding the environment and the ability of regulators or regulatory agencies to regulate. So one thing that future litigants or future people that are involved in court cases will be able to do is say, in Michigan versus EPA, the Supreme Court found this, and this is the new precedent, and this is what we need to follow. So they'll be able to stand on this case. And my guess, my belief is that future cases will be decided based on what was found in this case. So my basic conclusion is that this case is really important because it's going to have lots of impacts on the two areas I discussed, and it's going to be a decision that could stand for quite a while, especially if the court composition remains basically the same in terms of so-called conservative justices and so-called liberal justices. And as long as they are willing to go along with this decision and they don't find any major errors, or future justices don't believe that there was like a big mistake in the way that the court came to this conclusion, I think it could be around for a long time. And so we'll have to see what the impact will be, but I'm fairly certain it will be something along the lines of what I discussed. And so I hope that my explanation of this paper has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. I actually found this topic to be really difficult because it just deals with so many different details about about environmental law, about laws enacted by Congress, and then administrative law, the rights of agencies to enact and enforce rules, and then all the different decisions that the Supreme Court made in the past regarding the subjects that we're talking about. So honestly, this paper was really difficult for me to write because there was just so much to it, and it was so difficult to understand. But I hope that I've been able to break it down a little bit so that you can get a better picture of what the court decided and what it means. Again, if you have any questions, please ask me, and I'll try to get an answer for you. And thanks for watching.